Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of super spy James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Lately, we've been exploring the films of Roger Moore. We had just discussed The Spy Who Loved Me, which brings us to Moonraker. Moonraker and The Spy Who Loved Me are something of a pair. In many ways, the Roger Moore era could be broken up into three distinct eras depending on the director. So we had the Guy Hamilton era with Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, and that had a very distinct take on Roger Moore's Bond. Then you had The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, both of which were directed by Lewis Gilbert. And then you have the John Glenn films that followed, starting with For Your Eyes Only and concluding, at least with Roger Moore, with A View to a Kill. And each of those have their own sensibilities, though I think Moore's characterization as Bond remains relatively fixed after the Lewis Gilbert era, particularly here in Moonraker. The Spy Who Loved Me, as I described in my video, is a bit of a transitional film for Moore. It is kind of bridging the gap between the crueler, darker version of the character and the more tender, approachable, slightly sentimental version of the character that we get in the films that follow. And really that's where Moonraker comes into play. I feel like Moore is really at his most comfortable here. There's a sense in which he doesn't feel like he has anything to prove. He feels very at home in Moonraker. And in many ways, Moonraker is very intentionally attempting to mirror The Spy Who Loved Me. It is attempting to recapture its success. When the Bond films have a particularly successful entry, it's usually the case that the follow-up tries to double down on it in one way or another. Certainly you see that as far back as, Goldfinger and Thunderball, with Thunderball trying to really amp up a lot of the things that were successful in Goldfinger. You see that again here with Moonraker really trying to do The Spy Who Loved Me, but go even further. And Bond goes about as far as he can go in Moonraker. He goes to outer space, which is a decision you can either roll with or you don't. I roll with it. I love Moonraker. I prefer Moonraker to The Spy Who Loved Me for a variety of reasons. But I will say, for those who favor The Spy Who Loved Me, that I think The Spy Who Loved Me's highs are sometimes a bit higher than those of the highs of Moonraker, and Moonraker's lows can be a little bit lower than Spy Who Loved Me's lows, but I think Moonraker has a much better sense of momentum. It has a much better sense of audience engagement. Moonraker's sins are largely sins of just trying to entertain a little bit too hard. I am inclined to forgive movies that stumble when they're just trying to be so aggressively entertaining that they make some missteps or skew in the wrong direction. Because that's a very forgivable sort of stumble. It's very affable. They're being very... They're sins of a kind of generosity to the audience. They're not trying to condescend to the audience. They are not trying to diminish them. If anything, they are trying to play to the audience so strongly that they become a little bit unbalanced. And that's what we see with Moonraker. And I think we saw that too with the prior Roger Moore movies too. But I think Moonraker, all in all, just plays very well from start to finish. It has a good sense of momentum. And let's just talk about, I think we're going to mostly talk about Moonraker in a way that is a little bit more chronological than I often discuss these movies, as we kind of go through the movie set piece by set piece. Because I think, that's how Moonraker presents itself. At the end of the pre-title sequence, there is a bit of an in-joke subverting the end of the pre-title sequence from The Spy Who Loved Me. So The Spy Who Loved Me's iconic opening sequence ends with a very thrilling stunt where Bond leaps off a cliff and parachutes down into the title sequence. Moonraker flips that with a very goofy silly joke where Jaws can't really find his parachute. He kind of breaks his parachute cord and tumbles down into a circus tent, collapsing the circus tent, and that collapse brings us right into the title sequence. It's essentially repetition with a joke. It's a very broad play to the cheap seats sort of joke. But the circus, in many ways, is a good metaphor for what Moonraker is. It's kind of like a series of distinct acts and set pieces, each of which are meant to kind of entertain the audience. And that way, there's some sort of like loose connective tissue driving them. And I think there's a pretty decent conflict between Bond and the villain here that is propelling things forward in a way we didn't have in The Spy Who Loved Me. But there is also a sense of like, hey, look over here. Here's a new kind of like entertaining act to behold. And over here, there's, you know, Bond in a hovercraft, a gondola in Venice. And over here, you know, Bond by Mayan pyramid. You know, like, it's that kind of like, hey, look over here. Something new, cool to see. Look over here. Aren't you impressed by this? With like kind of like interspersed like comic acts, essentially from like Jaws, who is, I guess, in some ways this movie's equivalent of a clown entertaining the audience, with some notable exceptions, and we'll get to those. All in all, though, I think the pre-title sequence for Moonraker is excellent. Right from the get-go, we are introduced to the Moonraker shuttle itself during its hijacking sequence. And right off the bat, we are presented with one of the things that makes Moonraker really special, which is one of John Barry's greatest scores. John Barry's great talent is that he gives the Bond films a natural sense of poetry and gravitas they otherwise wouldn't have. And that is so true in Moonraker. The score for Moonraker is so above and beyond what is fairly light, fluffy material. It is not just a great Bond score, it is one of the all-time great scores. And especially when Barry is playing with the more grandeur of traveling into space, the giant track called Flight into Space that accompanies the climactic journey to the Drax space station at the end of this movie is just breathtakingly gorgeous work from John Barry. And right from the get-go, you're getting that in the hijack of the shuttle. It just gives it such oomph and grandeur. And it's something that I have generally felt missing in the prior three more installments. Even The Man with the Golden Gun, John Barry scored it, but John Barry's score in that movie is not in that more poetic, grandiose direction. It's almost a little bit more feeding into the film's sort of goofy, silly nature. In The Man with the Golden Gun, John Barry was actually the guy who added the slide whistle to the big climactic, big car stunt that, you know, defined that movie. You know, it's kind of minimizing it. In this movie, John Barry is really magnifying everything that's happening on screen. He's not minimizing anything. He's adding dramatic weight and heft. He's not trivializing it. And it adds a lot of punch to me. I'm very sensitive to music in movies. I'm very attentive to music in movies. For me, that is a significant piece of what makes cinema powerful, is the ability to pair image with music. And Moonraker really gets that right when it leans into that. And there are a number of sequences I'll talk about that kind of do that. But right from the gate, we get that with the hijacking the Moonraker. That's kind of like a brief prelude before we're thrown into one of the most thrilling stunt sequences in movie history. Moonraker had a tall order ahead of it to kind of outdo the leap off a cliff that The Spy Who Loved Me concluded with in its pre-title sequence. And I don't know that it finds a single moment that is instantly as arresting as that. However, the skydiving sequence here, the free fall sequence, is so thrilling. Even though you can tell that stunt doubles are in play, the raw footage of free fall in that widescreen without the augmentation of, you know, a lot of special effects is so, you know, I don't know, it still takes my breath away every time I see it. It's so arresting, it's so exciting, that in many ways I enjoy it more than The Spy Who Loved Me's pre-title sequence, because I think The Spy Who Loved Me's pre-title sequence has a great climactic stunt, but a lot of the skiing stuff is kind of like more hokey than exciting, whereas Moonraker's pre-title sequence is still to this day really thrilling. I mean, even when Mission Impossible Fallout tried to do a version of it with Tom Cruise, it just doesn't have the same effect because there's just so much CGI in the Fallout version with like lightning and stuff added that it just takes away from the raw excitement of just seeing people tumble through the air. And that's one of the things that you have to really give credit to the Roger Moore Bond movies when they lean into that, is that a lot of the stunt work, looking back at it, is just very traditional stunt work. Yeah, we know Roger himself is not the guy doing a lot of these breathtaking stunts, but the stunt work is very good film craft. And even in something as like when we get to A View to Kill and Bond is driving, you know, through Paris in what is a very silly vehicle chase, the stunt work is just kind of exciting because it's just a world apart from the kind of stunt work we see in movies today. Like in something like you go to see a Fast and Furious movie where, yeah, we know notionally that there are real cars driving somewhere, but there's just so much effects work layered on top of it that it just feels like you're watching something unreal. Whereas when you're watching the stunts in a Roger Moore movie, it really feels like you're just watching people do something really risky and breathtaking. And I think Moonraker captures that right from the get-go. And then, as noted, it launches us into the title theme with Jaws, who is kind of, you know, making a reappearance here a la Sheriff J.W. Pepper. You know, he doesn't really need to be in the movie per se, but he's kind of brought back because he's a popular figure. And I think Jaws' return in a sequel is much more successful than J.W. Pepper's, because Jaws at least gets some stronger moments in this movie. The pre-title sequence isn't necessarily one of them. But we're thrown into the title sequence, and this continues this trend that The Spy Who Left Me started of the Roger Moore themes being more tender and romantic and soft. And this kind of mirrors the softness that we're starting to see in Moore's Bond as a version of the character. And I don't think Moonraker necessarily is one of the best Bond songs in terms of when it's performed by a vocalist, but it is one of John Barry's best romantic melodies. When it's performed as an instrumental throughout the score, it's really sensational. Especially in the romantic scenes with Bond and Corinne Dufour, who I'll talk about a little bit more later. But Bond is introduced after the title sequence, and we get a rendition of a dynamic that we have started to see throughout the early Moore Bond movies, which is Roger Moore's Bond's somewhat prickly relationship with M, and that relationship with M kind of interplays with his dynamic with Q and Gadgetry. In Live and Let Die, we saw Roger Moore, you know, meet M in his flat, and they had a bit of a tiff over Bond's new watch and the gadgetry there. We're getting a new rendition of that where Bond is issued a kind of like nerve-triggered dart gun, and he effectively damages one of M's paintings in his office in trying it out in a very funny moment. And it kind of reframes that dynamic, but it's also kind of establishing Roger Moore's Bond as a guy who takes very naturally to gadgetry. There's a sense in which Roger Moore's Bond is very quick to take on more advanced gadgetry. He picks it up. He doesn't need a lot of time to grow accustomed to it. There's not the sense that you had with kind of like Sean Connery's Bond, where Sean Connery's Bond felt a little bit like a Luddite who was kind of like reluctant to take on gadgetry. Roger Moore's Bond is much more keen to lean into it, which also suits with his taste in watches. He's graduated now from Rolex to digital Seikos, which he wore in The Spy Who Loved Me and is now wearing again in Moonraker. The sense that Roger Moore's Bond embraces technology a little bit more readily. And I like the dart gadget. I think the dart gadget is really cool, especially since it's one of these gadgets that gets reused throughout the movie. We don't see this as much anymore, that gadgets get introduced at one point and then just continue to reappear as part of Bond's equipment throughout the movie. I do really enjoy when the Bond films do that. It gives a level of intentionality to the gadgetry. You saw that in Live and Let Die, where Bond's watch is introduced, and he is using that magnetized watch over and over and over again in Live and Let Die. And again, here you get two notable uses of the dart gun. One for Bond to get out of the centrifuge, and then one when he really kills the villain at the end. And it's kind of nice to see that it's really treated like a piece of equipment he's really bringing with him throughout the entirety of the mission. So Bond is sent to pursue Drax. And so let's talk about Hugo Drax for a little bit here, because the Drax estate is a European estate that he has created in the midst of California. Drax is a very interesting character. He's played wonderfully by Michael Lonsdale. He has some of the best dry villain dialogue in the series, and his interplay with Roger Moore's Bond is kind of electric from the get-go. There's just such dripping condescension from Drax. And Drax is, in some ways, an exaggerated depiction of, like, European excess. This sort of self-aggrandizing wannabe aristocracy. He's even doing, the sort of like hunting stuff that he's doing on his estate in California. It's like very much this pageantry of what aristocracy looks like. Drax has kind of built himself into a caricature of the nobility, right? And this fits in with his trajectory and plan. He is essentially a version of like the sort of like Nazi-ish obsession with racial purity and creating a sort of dynasty of like pure humanity to rule over the rest of it. It's not specifically Nazi coded, but the implication is very much there. This is very much a continuation of that sort of German elite eugenicist impulse that was there in the mid-20th century, and you see it kind of carried forward here and framed in a new like sci-fi way, right? His utopia is tainted by this sort of limited 20th century thinking. He's kind of regressive. He's bringing like the regressive aspects of European intellectualism together with like its sort of condescending aristocracy in line with this sort of utopianism together, and it creates a fairly toxic stew that Bond then has to thwart. And Bond is a pretty good opposition to that, because Bond himself is a bit of a trickster figure, especially Roger Moore's Bond, because Moore's Bond is both, as we discussed with The Spy Who Loved Me, like a quintessentially British icon, but he is also a bit of a, class clown, we might say. He's not quite part of the establishment, and you kind of see the way in which he's always, kind of flipping off the establishment, like at the end of these movies where he's romancing women, and it's always getting in the way of like Bond being introduced to, the elite. So you like both Spy Who Loved Me, Moonraker, For Your Eyes Only, we'll do it again with like a Margaret Thatcher stand-in where, Bond will be Bond is kind of like the idea of this character, and he's kind of like a trickster figure that flummoxes the villains and also flummoxes even like the more stiff British types, right? So he's British, but he's playful. There's a little bit more of that spirited Britishness about him that really kind of came about in the late 60s and carried through in the 70s. He's not an establishment figure, and that puts him as a nice opposing figure to characters that do feel like they're at least representative of or attempting to conjure up a bit of that like European establishment. He's a natural opposition to that. His first romance in this movie is Corinne Dufour, who I think is really the first successful romantic figure of the Roger Moore era. That's not to say that the prior films didn't have their strong points with romance. I think Anya was a strong step in the right direction in The Spy Who Loved Me. And I really enjoy the way that started to emphasize Roger Moore's aptitude for playing that sort of like tender, more sentimental romantic figure. But I think it really hits its stride here with his relationship with Corinne, who is a lovely character here, has very natural chemistry with Roger Moore's Bond. Their engagement together just feels very natural, feels very easy. It feels very authentically tender. Their banter together is very sweet. I love the line about her having a heart of gold, and like that sort of interplay that they have. And it's also clear that they're not making too much of this relationship. It's not a big thing for either of them. It's just one night. But they both naturally like each other and fall easily into, that their time together. And it just feels very authentic in a way that I can't quite say for any of the prior Roger Moore Bond film romances. Corinne also gets one of, I think, the great sequences in any Bond movie, which is her death scene. She is pursued by Drax's dogs and is kind of brutally murdered in this movie off screen, thankfully. But it is a sequence that is so wonderfully dreamlike and nightmarish. It's very much in the vocabulary of a horror movie, and just captures the dreamlike quick character that I really expect a Bond movie to have, at least for certain sequences. It's that sort of surreal, dreamlike, nightmarish character that comes straight, I think, out of the Fleming novels, and it's presented here so wonderfully. John Barry's score during that moment is particularly evocative. It's really great, and that moment coincides with another very good moment for Roger Moore's Bond, which is when he, effectively pulls the rug out from under Drax, when Drax puts an assassin in the tree to shoot Bond, and Bond, without missing a beat, takes the assassin out. I think Roger Moore has never been cooler than he is in that moment. That moment is quintessentially cool Bond, when he just says, "Did I?" and raises the eyebrow, and then, it's just effortless. And that's the kind of thing that I really love from Roger Moore's Bond, when he is just so able to put the villain in his place with this aura of like smug self-assurance. Like he is just so confident, and just so sure of himself. And it's particularly nice to get that moment after what we had earlier in that this segment of the movie, which is when Bond is put in the centrifuge, which is another terrific, like, how is Bond going to get out of this sort of moment, which the Bond movies occasionally give us, where Bond really just feels like he's, stuck in a death trap, and you're really, like, is really close to meeting his demise. And you got to give credit for Moore's performance when he's leaving the centrifuge after he's kind of shut it down, and he just looks so haggard, so genuinely shaken up by his experience. It's a great bit of acting from Moore, and is one of the best moments in the series, I think, for when Bond just looks like he's been put through the ringer. So, like, to have that moment happen earlier, and then have this kind of like callback to it, where Bond kind of puts Drax in his place and leaves his estate, is just tremendous. And in general, the whole first act of this movie is really set up as this sort of like back and forth byplay between Drax and Bond. And I think that's what I really start to like about this movie, is just that central conflict just plays out really well. They are very naturally opposing forces. Now, in the midst of their conflict, we also have Holly Goodhead, who is this film's successor to the Anya character from Spy Who Loved Me. She is a another spy that Bond is meeting who has another sort of like cat and mouse relationship with Bond. I think Holly Goodhead is a mostly functional character, is I guess the way I would put it. I don't think there's a lot to the character, but I think I don't know, she gives more enough to work with that their scenes together are entertaining to watch. But I think she is, a considerably less interesting character than Corin, and is also a less interesting character than Anya, just because she doesn't have the personal angle that is attaching her to the story in any way. But, she's in the mix, as a lot of Bond girls tend to be. She's just kind of like there for the ride. She gets some decent moments along the way, but she is mostly there, I think, and is her great success is just giving Roger Moore kind of someone to bounce dialogue off of. And Roger Moore's Bond gets a lot of really good dialogue in this movie. Once this movie leaves the Drax estate, we are in Venice. And this is when what I talked about, that sort of like real circus feel for the movie, really starts to set in, where we're getting this sort of sense of like, okay, here's a new set piece, here's a new set piece. It's kind of like the movie keeps following that vein right up through its space climax. I think Venice is a tremendously atmospheric location for Bond. I think the movie has a lot of fun with that, even when it's being pretty silly here, which is, the hovercraft gondola and the assassin coming out of the coffin on top of the gondola. It's all very goofy and, absurd. It has a kind of charm to it, just given the atmosphere around it. And I think there are some genuinely, like, darker moments here too, like when Bond stumbles in the laboratory and the scientists are killed because of the vial getting broken, and the wonderful fight in the glass museum, which is the kind of set piece I love to see in these movies, where it's just sort of like, Bond fights a henchman so many different times in this series. It really, depends on the caliber of the henchman and the caliber of the setting. And in this case, the setting is fun. It's really fun to watch guys just like break a bunch of like priceless artifacts in the midst of fighting each other. And there's kind of a good dynamic there that I admire. So the Venice set piece is kind of like, I think folks start to roll their eyes if you're not on board with Moonraker once you get to the hovercraft gondola, which is the kind of very absurd set piece that starts to distinguish, the silliness of this movie, that will then kind of like slightly escalate as the movie continues from here, which is saying something given how absurd and double-taking Pigeon is. But, it's kind of that thing where The Spy Who Loved Me introduced the idea that, they're going to start taking people out of the movie in a very big way once it started playing Lawrence of Arabia music for Bond walking in the desert. It's this sort of very, like, self-aware, hey, guys, remember, you're just watching a movie here kind of effect that is very unique to the more Bond films. And again, it's kind of amped up here. There's the sense in which, Moonraker wants you to have a good time, but also be aware that you're just kind of like, it's just a movie, guys. It's just a movie. And if you're on board with that sort of attitude, as I am, as long as it's being colorful and swinging for the fences enough, and Moonraker is always almost swinging for the fences, I think it works just fine. But I do really like once Bond gets to Brazil for the Rio stuff, because that actually brings Jaws back to this sort of like horror tones you sometimes got in The Spy Who Loved Me. I think it's actually very chilling when Jaws makes his appearance in that big parade, like clown head, and him just kind of like walking down the alleyway is actually one of the most ominous and intimidating moments in the series, because it's just so deeply strange. And he gets very close to killing Manuela, right? Manuela with the just by biting her neck, that sort of vampire effect that Jaws has. It's a very, stark moment, and it kind of like, along with the death of Corinne, shows that the way that this movie is kind of like willing to flirt with the occasional extremes to just like add a little bit of spice into the mix. And given how much Jaws is played for laughs and silliness in this movie, it's kind of a nice callback to some of the darker touches about the character in The Spy Who Loved Me, and gives some weight to the rather memorable line, you know, his name is Jaws, he kills people, that, you know, that Moore tells Holly Goodhead when he's on the cable car. You know, so we also get, you know, a bit of the same sort of like Moore's Bond, you know, getting local color that he did in Egypt, but here it's transplanted to like the Brazilian monastery, where we find that, you know, there's like a spy training school in the monastery, and Bond is given, you know, his spy boat experience to travel down the river. I think, you know, all that is perfectly in good fun. The boat chase is exciting. And in general, like, this whole segment of the movie, Venice to Brazil, it has a kind of slapdashy quality to it, in the sense that it's just kind of like lurching from set piece to set piece as Bond is following the trail that Drax has left behind. But it has like enough of a spark, because everything is just like so, you know, there's such a wonderfully like, hey, look at me kind of energy to all of the little whiz-bang showmanship that's going on there. And the movie, for me, really starts to pick up again once Bond follows one of Drax's, you know, perfect females to the temple where Drax has his lair. And it's such a wonderfully, again, sort of strange, dreamlike sequence. John Barry's score brings in all this, like, almost angelic chorus as Bond is following her through the jungle. And then, you know, he's tangling with a python. And then it's right back to that wonderful dynamic with him and Drax, where they're just kind of bouncing dialogue off of each other. It's just kind of like that, you know, wonderful, great opposition that they so naturally have to one another in such a great setting. Ken Adams' sets in this movie are generally tremendous. And don't get me wrong, Ken Adams had some wonderful sets in The Spy Who Loved Me too. In many ways, the tanker set is singularly more impressive than any single set in Moonraker. But I actually like the look of Moonraker more than I like the look of The Spy Who Loved Me. It's a little bit more interested in light and shadow in the way that it's filmed, and Ken Adams' designs lean more in his into his talent for sort of science fiction. You know, he was famously the designer of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and we see here that he's getting to once again explore spaceships. I think in many ways the grand climactic sequence in outer space, which you're either going to go with or you're not, and I'm here for it, because I think when it works, it's working really well, and it just works on the level of great sci-fi spectacle, because you have Ken Adams' incredible visual designs, like the Drax space station looks incredible. You're getting wonderful visual effects shots of these shuttles in space, and you're getting John Barry's tremendous score giving all that sort of like heft to it, right? I think all of that really adds a level of, you know, of real escapism to what is, you know, for many people, the series is equivalent of jumping the shark. And I understand that, but it is, for me, altogether much more engaging than the equivalent sequences in The Spy Who Loved Me with the tanker or with Bond fighting Jaws in Atlantis. I think the stuff here, it just has a little bit more spice and visual grandeur, and again, is anchored in that wonderful Drax-Bond antagonism, which carries up right until the moment where Bond ejects Drax out of a space lock, out of an airlock into outer space, which is the only way Drax could really go. I mean, honestly, in a way that would be satisfying. And of course, this movie's great version of the joke is Bond and Holly being in outer space together. You don't get a grander statement than that. If anything, this movie magnifies the idea that existed in The Spy Who Loved Me, that Bond is sort of like an icon that defies the laws of space and time. He's kind of like both at home in the greatest extremes of science fiction as he is wandering the ancient temples of the old world. There's a sense in which both Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker are kind of like big thematic statements that Bond as a character is essentially like an immortal icon among the great mythic figures, this sort of undeniably legendary hero. And I honestly kind of like that take. It's a take that we don't really ever get again. Obviously, subsequent films will play with the idea of Bond as an icon. Skyfall does its version of it. GoldenEye is doing a version of it. It's not that doesn't come back, but this is really the purest version of Bond, almost abstracted into a sort of iconography, right? We're not supposed to take this character seriously in The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. He is not a figure that really exists in true narrative terms. He's almost like above narrative. He's almost above history. And Roger Moore's Bond is the only Bond who could really feel that way, because he just feels so naturally larger than life. So we will be heading back down to earth when we talk about For Your Eyes Only. I'm actually going to be taking a break after this video to change subjects. So the next video you see will not be about For Your Eyes Only, but we will get back to For Your Eyes Only in short order. And that's a real return to basics for Bond. And I look forward to discussing that all with you. Let me know what you think about Moonraker in the comments, and I look forward to catching you all in the next one.